Hi everyone, it's ANCAP Society here to talk about capitalism. Specifically, does it reduce poverty? Now the short answer to that is yes, but let me break down why exactly this is the case. First, we must define capitalism, as it's important to know baseline what we are talking about. Capitalism is an economics, private property social order, wherein the means of production are owned by entrepreneurial actors. In this social order, exchange is defined by individuals purchasing and selling goods based upon their own incentives to conduct said exchanges. It's a method by which resources are allocated under the principle of the parties of an exchange having no right to what the other has inherently. To say that capitalism began during the Industrial Revolution is necessarily incorrect, as capitalism is a social order phenomenon. Though capitalism was able to explode onto the scene as a serious way to raise living standards due to it, now allowing for the enhancement of labor through machines and tools which greatly changed the marginal output of labor. This meant that no longer was specialization reserved for the wealthiest of society, but moguls could provide goods and services en masse. This meant that there were incentives to serve the average man from an entrepreneurial perspective, opening the door up to rivalrous industrial production to gain the favor of the masses as a consumer stratum. This would increase levels of availability for highly productive employment regimes, leading to a rise in incomes alongside the new material wealth brought on by entrepreneurial efforts in serving the masses. To quote economist Ludwig von Mises from his 1949 opus Human Action, the laissez-faire ideology and its offshoot, the Industrial Revolution, blasted the ideological and institutional barriers to progress and welfare. They demolished the social order, in which a constantly increasing number of people were doomed to abject need and destitution. The processing trades of earlier ages had almost exclusively catered to the wants of the well-to-do. Their expansion was limited by the amount of luxuries the wealthier strata of the population could afford. Those not engaged in the production of primary commodities could earn a living only as far as the upper classes were disposed to utilize their skill and services. But now a different principle came into operation. The factory system inaugurated a new mode of marketing, as well as of production. Its characteristic feature was that the manufactures were not designed for the consumption of a few well-to-do only, but for the consumption of those who had hitherto played but a negligible role as consumers. Cheap things for the many was the objective of the factory system. The classical factory of the early days of the Industrial Revolution was the cotton mill. Now, the cotton goods, it turned out, were not something the rich were asking for. These wealthy people clung to silk, linen, and cambric. Whenever the factory with its methods of mass production by means of power-driven machines invaded a new branch of production, it started with the production of cheap goods for the broad masses. The factories turned to the production of more refined and therefore more expensive goods only at a later stage, when the unprecedented improvement in the masses' standard of living which they caused made it profitable to apply the methods of mass production also to these better articles. Thus, for instance, the factory-made shoe was for many years bought only by the proletarians, while the wealthier consumers continued to patronize the custom shoemakers. The much-talked-about sweatshops did not produce clothes for the rich, but for people in modest circumstances. The fashionable ladies and gentlemen preferred and still do prefer custom-made frocks and suits. The outstanding fact about the Industrial Revolution is that it opened an age of mass production for the needs of the masses. The wage earners are no longer people toiling merely for other people's well-being. They themselves are the main consumers of the products the factories turn out. Big business depends upon mass consumption. There is, in present-day America, not a single branch of big business that would not cater to the needs of the masses. The very principle of capitalist entrepreneurship is to provide for the common man. In his capacity as consumer, the common man is the sovereign whose buying or abstention from buying decides the fate of entrepreneurial activities. There is in the market economy no other means of acquiring and preserving wealth than by supplying the masses in the best and cheapest way with all the goods they ask for. End quote. Now, how does capitalism sponsor reigning the standard of living theoretically? Well, from a theoretical perspective, it does a few key things. In the market process of allocating resources, firms, providers, must produce goods and services which are deemed desirable by consumers in an environment wherein consumers have the ability to pursue both direct and indirect substitutes, which rival providers are eager to make available in the operation or rather continuous process of competition. One way I like to show the proof of this, inductively speaking, is by examining the outcomes of liberalization, the process by which a nation lifts its restrictions on trade and dissolves state monopolies in favor of market control over the vast allocation resources and coordination of courses. This freeing up of capital allows for a symbiotic order of productive exchange. This creates economic growth which must correlate to increased nominal incomes as it comes from increased productivity. In an analysis of 129 countries from 1980 to 2005 by Drive James D. Gwaltney and Dr. Joseph S. Connors, published in Accepting the Invisible Hand, Analysis of these data indicates that the extreme poverty rate of developing economies fell from 58.3% in 1980 to 25.1% in 2005. During the same 25-year period, the moderate poverty rate in the less developed world declined from 75.3% to 45.6%. This progress was propelled by a huge reduction in both extreme and moderate poverty rates in China. However, except for sub-Saharan Africa, substantial progress was achieved throughout most of the developing world. Economic freedom played a central role in this progress. Compared to those that were less free, countries with higher economic freedom ratings during 1980 to 2005 had lower rates of both extreme and moderate poverty in 2005. More importantly, countries with higher levels of economic freedom in 1980 and larger increases in economic freedom during the 1980s and 1990s achieved larger poverty rate reductions than economies that were less free. These relationships were true even after adjustment for geographic and locational factors and foreign assistance as a share of income. The positive relations between the level and change in economic freedom and reductions in poverty were both statistically significant and robust across alternative specifications. Some fear that growth propelled by economic freedom will leave the poor behind. This was not the case during 1980 to 2005. During this quarter of a century, the developing countries that moved the most toward economic freedom achieved both strong economic growth and substantial reductions in poverty. This indicates that an institutional and policy environment consistent with economic freedom is an important ingredient for progress against poverty. In my thesis, which you guys can totally check out by becoming a patron to my Patreon link in the description, I make a comprehensive case utilizing liberalization studies alongside general empirical accounts like Duan Hoa liberalization of 1986 reducing poverty gradually in Vietnam alongside 1979 China's liberalization reforms, which turned it into a modern economic powerhouse. I also explain how free trade policy even uplifted Mexico despite its notoriously unproductive terrain. Thank you so much for all your support, and I hope this brief video helped you understand how capitalism reduces poverty by giving us a production scheme guided to be more beneficial to consumers, as without adhering to such firms of the market variety become insolvent. Ergo, productivity has incentives to increase with a coherent barometer for what consumers want. Incomes rise due to increased capital stock and firms offer better goods to remove our unease.